Zander Fox walked into that courthouse thinking he was about to lose everything. His ex-wife sat across the aisle with her attorney, already counting money that wasn't hers yet. She had no idea that the man she'd dismissed as a simple mechanic had been preparing for this day since the moment she walked out. What happened next wasn't just a divorce settlement. It was a masterclass in patience, preparation, and the power of staying quiet when everyone else is making noise. The judge opened a single envelope, and in 30 seconds, everything she thought she knew about her ex-husband crumbled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the garage windows like it was trying to break through. Zander Fox wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag, the familiar scent of motor oil and metal shavings filling his lungs. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m. Most people would have gone home hours ago, but Zander had learned long ago that the quiet hours were when real work got done. No interruptions, no customers asking when their car would be ready, just him and the engines that never lied to him. His phone buzzed against the workbench. A text message lit up the screen, and even before he read it, Zander knew what it would say. The notification was from his attorney, Marcus Rothwell, and the message was brief. Final hearing set for Thursday, 9 a.m. She's pushing for full disclosure. Be ready. Zander set the phone down without responding. He'd been ready for this conversation for 3 years, ever since the day Cassandra walked out of their house with her suitcases and a lawyer's business card already tucked in her purse. She'd stood in their kitchen that morning, designer heels clicking against the tile floor, and delivered her departure speech like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. "I can't do this anymore, Zander. I married a man with ambition, not someone who's content fixing other people's cars for the rest of his life. I need more than this." She gestured around their modest kitchen like it was a prison cell. "My attorney says I'm entitled to half of everything. I think that's fair, don't you?" Fair. The word had echoed in his mind for months after she left. Cassandra had always been good with words, the kind of person who could make her selfishness sound like nobility. She'd never asked about his work beyond the surface, never wondered why a simple mechanic could afford their house in the quiet suburban neighborhood, never questioned how she managed to pay for her spa weekends and shopping trips without ever seeming stressed about money. That night, 3 years ago, after she'd loaded her BMW with everything she deemed worth taking, Zander had sat in his garage workshop until dawn. Not working on any car, just thinking. Cassandra thought she knew everything about him because she'd shared his bed for 5 years and his last name for 3. She thought his life was as simple as the coverall she wore to work each day. What she didn't know could fill libraries. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the metal roof like an impatient crowd. Zander walked over to his tool chest, a massive red cabinet that had belonged to his father before him. Most people saw it as just another piece of garage equipment, but Zander knew better. His father, Samuel Fox, had been a man who understood the value of hiding things in plain sight. Zander pulled out the bottom drawer, reached underneath, and felt for the small lever his father had installed decades ago. A soft click, and a hidden compartment slid open. Inside, wrapped in waterproof plastic, were documents that told a very different story about Zander Fox than the one Cassandra had been telling her friends. Samuel Fox hadn't just been a mechanic. He'd been an inventor. A man who'd spent his evenings in this very garage developing improvements to automotive systems that major manufacturers eventually licensed for millions. The patents had been filed under a holding company, buried in corporate structures that made them invisible to casual observation. When Samuel died, those patents had passed to his son, along with something more valuable than money, the knowledge of how to stay invisible while building an empire. The first document in the hidden compartment was a patent certificate, dated 15 years ago. Zander had been 22 then, fresh out of technical college, working in his father's garage and learning that real wealth wasn't about flashy displays. It was about solving problems quietly and letting other people take credit while you collected checks they never saw coming. The improvement he'd patented was simple but revolutionary. A fuel injection system modification that increased efficiency by 12% while reducing emissions. Ford had licensed it first, then General Motors, then Toyota. The royalty checks had been flowing for over a decade, deposited into accounts that existed in corporate names Cassandra had never heard of. Zander pulled out his phone and opened an app that looked like a simple calculator. But when he entered a specific sequence of numbers, it became something else entirely. A portal to financial accounts that showed a very different picture of his worth. The screen displayed balances that would have made Cassandra's designer handbag collection look like pocket change. The second patent had come 3 years later, an improvement to anti-lock braking systems that every major manufacturer now used. The third was a suspension modification that made trucks 20% more fuel efficient. Each patent had been filed under different holding companies. Each company was owned by a trust, and each trust was managed by attorneys who specialized in keeping wealthy people invisible. His phone showed 17 active licensing agreements, with royalty payments deposited monthly into accounts spread across 3 different states. The total balance was approaching 8 figures, money earned from the mind of a man who spent his days with grease under his fingernails and slept in a house that looked like someone making $60,000 a year. But the patents were just the beginning. Zander's real masterpiece was what he'd built in the 5 years since Cassandra left. While she'd been telling anyone who would listen about how she'd escaped from her loser ex-husband, Zander had been using his patent income to fund something much bigger. Fox Innovations existed only on paper, registered in Delaware with an address that led to a small office building in Wilmington. The company had no employees, no physical location, no sign on any door. What it had was a portfolio of early-stage investments in automotive technology companies that were revolutionizing the industry. Electric vehicle startups, autonomous driving software developers, battery technology firms that were years ahead of their competition. Zander had learned from his father that the real money wasn't in building things yourself. It was in recognizing brilliance in others and betting on it before anyone else noticed. While major venture capital firms were still trying to understand the electric vehicle market, Zander had been quietly writing checks to graduate students with revolutionary ideas and engineers who were being ignored by their corporate employers. 3 of those investments had already been acquired by major manufacturers for amounts that made his patent royalties look like lunch money. The rest were growing exponentially, their valuations doubling every 18 months, as the automotive industry finally realized what Zander had seen years earlier. Everything was about to change, and the companies that adapted first would own the future. The rain outside was starting to ease, but Zander barely noticed. He was thinking about Thursday morning, about the moment when Cassandra's attorney would present their case to Judge Patricia Morrison. They would talk about marital assets, about the house they'd shared, about the garage business that generated enough income to support a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. They would ask for half of everything they could see. What they couldn't see was the network of trusts, holding companies, and investment vehicles that had been carefully constructed to remain invisible to exactly this kind of scrutiny. Cassandra's attorney had done his homework, but homework only works when you knew which questions to ask. They'd looked at Zander's tax returns and seen a small business owner who made a decent living. They'd examined his bank accounts and found modest balances that supported their narrative of a simple man with simple assets. They'd never found the other accounts because they'd never known to look for them. The holding companies that owned Zander's patents were registered in states where privacy laws made investigation nearly impossible. The investment returns were structured as business income for consulting services that existed only on paper. The trusts that managed his wealth were administered by law firms that specialize in keeping secrets. Zander's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from his actual attorney, not the family court lawyer who would be representing him on Thursday. Marcus Rothwell handled the divorce, but Victoria Sterling managed everything that mattered. Her email was characteristically brief. Contingency protocols activated. Documentation secured. Thursday will proceed as planned. Victoria Sterling was the kind of lawyer who charged $500 an hour and earned every penny. Her clients were people who had serious money and serious reasons to keep it private. Tech entrepreneurs who'd built billion-dollar companies in their garage. Entertainment executives whose compensation packages included stock options worth fortunes. Professional athletes who'd invested wisely and wanted to stay invisible. She'd been managing Zander's legal affairs for 7 years, ever since his patent income had reached the level where amateur hour wasn't good enough anymore. The plan they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. On Thursday, Cassandra's attorney would present his case for why his client deserves half of what he believed to be Zander's assets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He would talk about the house, the garage, the savings accounts he'd found. He would paint a picture of a woman who'd supported her husband's simple dreams and deserved compensation for her sacrifice. Then Marcus Rothwell would present their response. He would agree that Cassandra deserved her fair share of the marital assets. He would offer her exactly half of everything that had been acquired during their marriage, calculated down to the penny. The offer would be generous, fair, and completely devastating to her case. Because what Cassandra's attorney didn't know was that virtually everything he'd found had been accumulated after their separation. The house had been purchased with a loan that was paid down using income earned while they were living apart. The garage equipment had been financed through business accounts that were opened after she'd filed for divorce. Even the modest savings accounts he'd discovered contained money that post-dated their marriage. The real assets, the patents and investments and trusts that represented Zander's actual wealth, had been carefully documented as premarital property. Every investment had been made using funds that could be traced back to patents filed years before he'd ever met Cassandra. Every trust had been established with money earned from intellectual property that existed long before their first date. Zander had learned from watching his father that timing was everything. Samuel Fox had filed his first patents as a young man, years before he'd met Zander's mother. When he'd married, he'd brought substantial assets into the relationship, but he'd been smart enough to keep them separate. His wife had shared in the life those assets provided, but she'd never had a legal claim to the assets themselves. Zander had followed the same path, just more carefully. Every patent application had been filed before he'd started dating Cassandra. Every investment had been made using funds that pre-existed their relationship. When they'd married, he'd brought millions in assets to the union, but none of it had ever been commingled with marital property. The irony was perfect. Cassandra had married him thinking he was a simple mechanic with simple dreams. She'd never suspected that he was already wealthy, because wealth that doesn't announce itself is invisible to people who only recognize money when it's being spent conspicuously. She'd left him thinking she was trading up from a man with no ambition to a life with unlimited potential. What she'd actually done was walk away from a fortune and marry a pharmaceutical sales representative who drove a leased BMW and lived in an apartment he couldn't really afford. Her new husband, Derek Chen, was exactly the kind of man she thought she wanted. Well-dressed, well-spoken, ambitious in obvious ways. He took her to expensive restaurants and bought her jewelry with credit cards, and she mistook debt for prosperity. Zander had watched their relationship develop through social media posts that painted a picture of upgraded happiness. Cassandra in designer dresses at charity galas, Cassandra on vacation in places that looked expensive, Cassandra wearing rings that sparkled under restaurant lighting. She'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, funded by a man who was drowning in payments he could barely afford. Derek Chen made good money, but not the kind of money that supported the lifestyle Cassandra had grown accustomed to. His pharmaceutical sales job paid well, but it didn't pay private jet well. His company car was nice, but it wasn't own a fleet of vintage Ferraris nice. He was successful in conventional terms, but he wasn't wealthy in any terms that mattered. The beautiful part was that Cassandra had never looked back. She'd been so convinced that she'd traded up that she'd never wondered what she might have given up. She'd never asked herself why her ex-husband had seemed so unconcerned about her leaving, why he'd never fought for her, why he'd seemed almost relieved when she'd announced her decision to end their marriage. If she'd been curious, she might have noticed things. She might have wondered why a simple mechanic's garage was equipped with diagnostic computers that cost more than most people's cars. She might have questioned how a man who supposedly made modest income could afford to pay for her graduate school without ever seeming stressed about money. She might have investigated why her husband spent so many evenings in his workshop, long after any reasonable car repair work would have been finished. But curiosity had never been Cassandra's strength. She was the kind of person who saw what she expected to see and ignored everything else. When she'd looked at Zander, she'd seen coveralls and assumed poverty. She'd seen a man who worked with his hands and concluded he had no imagination. She'd seen someone who seemed content with his life and decided he lacked ambition. She'd never seen the patents on the wall of his workshop, framed and mounted like diplomas. She'd never asked about the technical journals stacked on his desk, filled with bookmarks and margin notes. She'd never wondered why automotive engineers from major manufacturers occasionally stopped by the garage for quiet conversations that had nothing to do with oil changes. Most importantly, she'd never asked about the locked file cabinet in the corner of his workshop, the one that contained correspondence from law firms and investment companies and patent licensing agencies. The cabinet was there in plain sight, but it might as well have been invisible. Cassandra had developed a talent for not seeing things that didn't fit her predetermined narrative. Thursday morning would be different. Thursday morning, the narrative would change permanently, and there would be no way for her to unsee what she'd been ignoring for years. Zander closed the hidden compartment in his tool chest and walked over to the window. The rain had stopped, and the parking lot outside was empty except for his truck, a 15-year-old Ford that ran perfectly because he'd rebuilt the engine himself using modifications that would eventually become his fourth patent. The truck looked exactly what it was, a working man's vehicle. What it didn't look like was transportation for someone whose investment portfolio was worth more than most small companies. Tomorrow, he would wear the same coveralls he wore every day, drive the same truck he'd been driving for years, and walk into a courthouse where everyone would see exactly what they expected to see. His ex-wife would be there in designer clothes she'd charged to credit cards, accompanied by an attorney who charged $300 an hour and thought he was handling a simple asset division case. Judge Patricia Morrison would be there too, and that was where things would get interesting. Judge Morrison had a reputation for being thorough, the kind of judge who read every document in detail and asked uncomfortable questions when something didn't add up. She'd been on the bench for 23 years, and she'd seen every kind of divorce case imaginable. She knew the difference between what people claimed to own and what they actually owned. More importantly, she knew the difference between people who were trying to hide assets and people who were trying to protect assets that had been legitimately earned and properly documented. She'd grown up in a family of small business owners, people who understood that success didn't always announce itself with expensive suits and flashy cars. Zander had chosen Judge Morrison's courtroom deliberately. Marcus Rothwell had been careful to file papers that would ensure their case was assigned to her docket, using procedural knowledge that most divorce attorneys never acquired. They'd wanted a judge who would appreciate nuance, someone who would take the time to understand the difference between hiding money and simply not advertising it. The hearing would start with Cassandra's attorney presenting his client's case. He would talk about the sacrifices she'd made during their marriage, about the support she'd provided to her husband's career, about the assets they'd built together during their years as a couple. He would present financial documents that painted a picture of modest success and argue that his client deserves half of everything they'd accumulated. Then it would be Marcus Rothwell's turn, and that's where the real show would begin. Marcus Rothwell wouldn't argue about Cassandra's right to marital assets. Instead, he would stipulate that she deserved exactly half of everything that qualified as marital property. He would present an itemized list of every asset that had been acquired during their marriage, calculated with accounting precision that would satisfy the most demanding audit. The total would be substantial, but not shocking. The equity in their house, the value of the garage equipment purchased during their marriage, savings accounts that had been funded with marital income. Added together, it would represent a fair division of what most people would consider a successful middle-class life. Then Judge Morrison would ask the question that would change everything. Mr. Rothwell, your client's income during the marriage appears to have been substantially higher than what these assets would suggest. Where is the rest of the money? And that's when Marcus would present the second set of documents, the ones that revealed the truth of Zander Fox. Patent registrations that predated his marriage by years. Investment accounts funded with premarital assets. Trust documents that established ownership of intellectual property that had been created before he'd ever met Cassandra. The numbers would be staggering, not because they represented new wealth, but because they represented wealth that had been carefully documented as separate property from the moment it was created. Every dollar could be traced back to sources that existed before Zander's marriage. Every investment could be shown to have been made with funds that belonged to him alone. Judge Morrison would examine the documents with the thoroughness that made her reputation. She would see intellectual property that had been generating substantial royalties for over a decade. She would see investment strategies that had turned those royalties into generational wealth. She would see a man who had built a fortune while living like someone who worked for a living. Most importantly, she'd see that every legal requirement had been met. The assets had been properly disclosed when required, properly documented when created, properly managed by qualified professionals throughout their existence. There had been no attempt to hide anything from legitimate scrutiny, only a deliberate choice to live quietly while building substantial wealth. Cassandra's attorney would demand time to investigate, to challenge the timing of the patent applications, to question the legitimacy of the premarital documentation. Judge Morrison would grant that time because she was thorough. The hearing would be continued for 30 days while independent experts verified every document and traced every financial transaction. 30 days later, they would return to the courtroom, and the independent investigation would confirm what Marcus Rothwell had presented. The patents were legitimate, filed years before the marriage. The investments were documented, made with funds that belonged to Zander alone. The wealth was real, substantial, and completely separate from anything that could be considered marital property. At that point, Judge Morrison would render her decision. Cassandra would receive exactly half of the marital assets, just as she'd requested. The amount would be fair and substantial, enough to provide financial security for years to come. It would also represent less than 1% of what Zander actually owned. The rest would remain where it had always been, in trusts and investment accounts and corporate structures that bore no resemblance to the simple mechanic most people saw when they looked at Zander Fox. The man who wore coveralls to work and drove a 15-year-old truck would walk out of the courthouse still wearing coveralls and driving the same truck. But he would also walk out with his fortune intact and his privacy protected. Cassandra would learn, probably through her attorney's investigation, that she had been married to a multimillionaire who had chosen to live like a working-class mechanic. She would discover that the man she'd dismissed as unambitious had been building an empire while she'd been planning her escape. She would realize that her decision to leave him for a pharmaceutical sales representative was the most expensive mistake of her life. But by then, it would be too late to matter. The divorce would be final, the assets distributed according to law, and Zander would be free to continue the life he'd built. Successful in ways that didn't require anyone else's recognition, wealthy in ways that didn't depend on anyone else's approval, and finally, permanently separated from a woman who had never understood what she'd had and had thrown it away for the illusion of something better. Zander turned off the lights in his workshop and headed for the door. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day. Oil changes, brake repairs, diagnostic work on engines that most people didn't understand. He would do the work he'd always done, in the place he'd always done it, wearing the same clothes he'd worn for years. The difference would be that tomorrow night, when he locked the garage and went home to his quiet house, he would know that his secrets were safe, his wealth was protected, and his former wife had finally gotten exactly what she'd asked for, her fair share of the assets she'd known about, and nothing more. Zander turned off the lights in his workshop and headed for the door. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day. Oil changes, brake repairs, diagnostic work on engines that most people didn't understand. He would do the work he'd always done, in the place he'd always done it, wearing the same clothes he'd worn for years. The difference would be that tomorrow night, when he locked the garage and went home to his quiet house, he would know that his secrets were safe, his wealth was protected, and his former wife had finally gotten exactly what she'd asked for, her fair share of the assets she'd known about, and nothing more. It had taken 3 years to reach this point. 3 years of letting Cassandra believe she'd escaped from a limited life to something unlimited. 3 years of allowing her attorney to think he was handling a routine divorce between a struggling mechanic and his ambitious ex-wife. 3 years of patient preparation for a single day in court when everything would become clear. But patience had always been Zander's greatest asset, even more valuable than his patents or his investments or his carefully hidden fortune. His father had taught him that the most powerful moves were the ones nobody saw coming, and the most secure victories were the ones that looked inevitable only after they'd already been won. Thursday morning would prove that lesson one final time, in a courtroom where a simple mechanic would outmaneuver lawyers and accountants and investigators not through deception or trickery, but through the simple expedient of being exactly who he'd always been. A man who solved problems quietly, built wealth invisibly, and never let anyone else's expectations define his possibilities. The rain had stopped completely now, and the sky was clearing. Tomorrow would be a beautiful day for justice. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew as Zander Fox pulled his truck into the parking space marked for defendants. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was technically the defendant in this proceeding, the one being accused of hiding assets and cheating his ex-wife out of her rightful share. If only they knew how backwards they had it. Marcus Rothwell was waiting by the entrance, briefcase in hand, wearing the kind of conservative Navy suit that said serious lawyer without screaming expensive lawyer. That was intentional. Everything about today was calculated to maintain the narrative until the perfect moment to shatter it completely. "Ready for this?" Marcus asked as Zander approached. His attorney had handled dozens of high-asset divorces, but never one quite like this. Usually, his clients were trying to minimize what they'd have to give up. Today, they were about to demonstrate just how much his client had never needed to share in the first place. "Been ready for 3 years," Zander replied, adjusting the collar of his button-down shirt. He'd chosen his clothes carefully, clean but not expensive, professional but not pretentious. The same outfit he might wear to meet with a parts supplier or attend a community college night class. Nothing that would suggest he belonged anywhere other than behind the counter of a small business. They walked through the metal detectors and up to the 3rd floor, where Family Court Division C conducted its daily business of dividing lives and assets. The hallway was filled with the usual mix of nervous petitioners, board attorneys, and court staff who'd seen every possible variation of human greed and disappointment. Cassandra was already there, seated on one of the wooden benches that lined the corridor. She wore a black dress that managed to look both modest and expensive, the kind of outfit that said she was taking this seriously but wasn't trying too hard. Her attorney, Richard Pemberton, sat beside her, reviewing notes on a yellow legal pad. Pemberton was exactly what Zander had expected. Mid-50s, silver hair, handmade shoes that probably cost more than most people made in a month. The kind of lawyer who took high-profile divorce cases because they generated the kind of publicity that attracted more high-profile clients. He specialized in maximizing settlements for scorned spouses, and his track record was impressive. What Pemberton didn't specialize in was cases where the apparently wealthy spouse turned out to be even wealthier than anyone had imagined, but in ways that completely protected those assets from division. He was about to get an education in the difference between hiding assets and simply not advertising them. Cassandra looked up as Zander and Marcus approached. For a moment, their eyes met, and Zander saw something he hadn't expected: uncertainty. She'd been so confident 3 years ago, so sure that she was trading up from a limited life to unlimited possibilities. Now, sitting in a courthouse where she was asking a judge to force her ex-husband to give her money, she looked like someone who was starting to wonder if she'd made the right choices. The uncertainty disappeared quickly, replaced by the determined expression of someone who'd convinced herself that she was the victim in this story. She turned away and went back to her conversation with Pemberton, probably rehearsing the narrative they'd constructed about her sacrifices and her ex-husband's obligation to share the wealth she'd helped him build. "Mr. Rothwell? Mr. Fox?" A court clerk appeared at the courtroom door. "Judge Morrison is ready for you." The courtroom was smaller than the ones you saw in movies, with wood paneling that had been polished to a dull shine and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. Judge Patricia Morrison sat behind the bench, a woman in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck. She'd been on the bench long enough to have seen every variation of divorce case imaginable, from bitter custody battles to complex business disputes. She had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and completely intolerant of attorney tricks or client deception. If you came into her courtroom with evidence, you'd better be prepared to defend every piece of it. "Good morning," Judge Morrison said as the parties took their seats at their respective tables. "This is the matter of Chen versus Fox, case number 2024-DR8847. We're here for final asset division proceedings. Mr. Pemberton, I believe you're representing the petitioner." Pemberton stood, smoothing his tie. "Yes, Your Honor, Richard Pemberton representing Mrs. Cassandra Chen, formerly Cassandra Fox." Judge Morrison made a note, then looked toward the defense table. "Mr. Rothwell?" "Marcus Rothwell representing Mr. Zander Fox, Your Honor." "Very well. Mr. Pemberton, I've reviewed your preliminary filings. Please present your case." What followed was exactly what Zander had expected. Pemberton painted a picture of a woman who had supported her husband's dreams, who had encouraged his small business ventures, who had contributed to their household while he built his career. He presented financial documents showing Zander's income over the course of their marriage, tax returns that reflected a gradually growing business, bank statements that showed steady but modest accumulation of wealth. Your Honor, during their 5-year marriage, Mrs. Chen provided emotional, practical, and financial support that enabled Mr. Fox to build his automotive repair business into a successful enterprise. She worked part-time while completing her graduate degree, contributing her earnings to their joint expenses and allowing Mr. Fox to reinvest profits back into the business. Pemberton moved to an easel where he'd mounted a chart showing what he claimed were the couple's joint assets. The house they'd shared, valued at $340,000 with $180,000 in equity. The garage and its equipment appraised at $85,000. Various bank accounts totaling $67,000. A retirement account with $23,000. Several vehicles worth a combined $31,000. The total marital estate, as we've been able to determine, has a value of approximately $386,000. Mrs. Chen is requesting her equitable share of these assets, which, under state law, would be 50%, or $193,000. Judge Morrison was taking notes, but Zander could see she was also studying the financial documents with the careful attention that made her reputation. She'd spent 23 years on the bench, and she knew when numbers didn't quite add up. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm looking at your client's former husband's tax returns. His reported income during the marriage was substantial enough to support a lifestyle that seems inconsistent with the asset accumulation you've presented. Where did the rest of the money go?" This was the question Pemberton had been dreading, and Zander could see him shifting slightly as he prepared his response. "Your Honor, that's exactly our concern. We believe Mr. Fox has been less than forthcoming about the full extent of his assets. We suspect there may be additional accounts or investments that haven't been disclosed." "And do you have evidence of these suspected hidden assets?" "We've requested full financial disclosure, Your Honor, but Mr. Fox's attorney has been uncooperative. We believe a more thorough investigation would reveal significant additional assets that should be subject to division." Judge Morrison turned her attention to Marcus Rothwell. "Mr. Rothwell, how does your client respond to these allegations?" Marcus stood, and Zander could see the slight smile that meant they were about to deploy their carefully planned strategy. "Your Honor, my client has been completely forthcoming about all assets that are subject to division under state law. We have no objection to providing complete financial disclosure. In fact, we welcome the opportunity to clarify exactly what assets exist and when they were acquired." He moved to his own easel, where he'd prepared a more detailed breakdown of the same assets Pemberton had presented. But his chart was more precise, with dates of acquisition and sources of funding clearly documented. Your Honor, we stipulate that Mrs. Chen is entitled to 50% of all marital assets. We've prepared a detailed accounting of every asset acquired during the marriage, and we're prepared to provide documentation for every claim. Marcus handed a thick folder to the court clerk, who passed it to Judge Morrison. What you'll find in that documentation, Your Honor, is that Mr. Fox has been completely transparent about marital assets. The problem isn't hidden assets. The problem is that Mr. Pemberton's investigation was incomplete. Judge Morrison opened the folder and began examining the first few pages. Zander watched her expression carefully, looking for the moment when she began to understand what she was seeing. It didn't take long. Mr. Rothwell, I'm seeing references here to intellectual property and investment accounts. Are these part of the marital estate? No, Your Honor. Those assets predate the marriage and have been maintained as separate property throughout the marriage, in accordance with state law. Pemberton was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing about any premarital assets. Mr. Fox's financial disclosures made no mention of significant separate property. Judge Morrison held up a hand. Mr. Pemberton, please sit down. Mr. Rothwell, please explain. Marcus walked back to his easel and flipped to a new chart, this one showing a timeline that stretched back 15 years. Your Honor, Mr. Fox is an inventor. He holds multiple patents for automotive system improvements that have been licensed to major manufacturers. The first of these patents was filed when he was 22 years old, 7 years before he met Mrs. Chen. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Cassandra was staring at the chart with an expression of growing shock, while Pemberton was frantically flipping through his notes as if he might find some reference to patents that he'd somehow missed. The income from these patents has been substantial and ongoing. Mr. Fox has used that income to fund additional research and development, resulting in additional patents and licensing agreements. He has also used patent income to make strategic investments in automotive technology companies. Marcus flipped to another chart, this one showing income streams that dwarfed anything Pemberton had presented. Your Honor, Mr. Fox's patent royalties alone exceed $200,000 per year. His investment returns typically exceed $300,000 annually. These income streams existed before his marriage and have been carefully maintained as separate property. Judge Morrison was studying the documentation with the intensity of someone who understood she was looking at something extraordinary. Mr. Rothwell, are you telling me that your client was already wealthy when he married Mrs. Chen? Yes, Your Honor, substantially wealthy. The automotive repair business that Mrs. Chen helped support was essentially a hobby for Mr. Fox. He continued operating it because he enjoys the work, not because he needed the income. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Cassandra looked like someone who had just been told that gravity worked backwards. Pemberton looked like a man who was rapidly calculating how much malpractice insurance he carried. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair. Mr. Rothwell, this is highly unusual. Why wasn't this information disclosed earlier in the proceedings? Your Honor, my client has disclosed everything he was required to disclose under state law.
Separate property that predates a marriage is not subject to division, and therefore not subject to mandatory disclosure unless specifically requested by the court or opposing counsel. Mr. Pemberton, did you specifically request disclosure of premarital assets? Pemberton was sweating now, his silver hair no longer looking quite so distinguished. Your Honor, we requested disclosure of all assets. We assumed that would include any separate property. You assumed incorrectly. Mr. Rothwell, I want to see complete documentation of these premarital assets. Patent filings, investment records, bank statements, everything. Marcus smiled. We have all of that prepared, Your Honor. We also have documentation showing that none of these assets were ever commingled with marital property. Mr. Fox was very careful to maintain the separate character of his premarital wealth. He handed another, even thicker folder to the clerk. This one contained 15 years of financial records, patent applications, licensing agreements, and investment statements. It was the complete financial history of a man who had built substantial wealth while living like a middle-class mechanic. Judge Morrison accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Zander, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire presentation. "Mr. Fox, I want to hear from you directly. Are you telling me that you were a millionaire when you married Mrs. Chen?" Zander stood slowly, the same deliberate movement he used when approaching a complicated engine repair. "Yes, Your Honor. Multimillionaire, actually. I had been for several years before we met." "And Mrs. Chen was unaware of this?" "Your Honor, I never lied to my wife about my financial situation. But I also never volunteered information that wasn't relevant to our daily life. My patent income and investments were managed by professional advisors and had no impact on our household finances." "Mr. Fox, why did you choose to live modestly if you had substantial wealth?" Zander had been preparing for this question for 3 years. "Your Honor, I learned from my father that wealth attracts the wrong kind of attention. People treat you differently when they know you have money. They want things from you. They make assumptions about your obligations to them. I preferred to be valued for who I was, not what I owned." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I'm getting divorced from someone who left me because she thought I wasn't wealthy enough for her ambitions. I think my father's approach was correct." The judge turned her attention back to Cassandra, who looked like she was having trouble breathing. "Mrs. Chen, were you aware that your husband had significant assets before your marriage?" Cassandra stood on shaking legs. "No, Your Honor. I had no idea. He drove an old truck. He worked in a garage. We lived in a modest house. Her voice trailed off as the magnitude of her mistake became clear. "You thought he was poor?" "Not poor, but ordinary, middle class. I thought he lacked ambition." Judge Morrison studied Cassandra for a long moment. "Mrs. Chen, you left your husband because you believed he wasn't successful enough?" Yes, I wanted more from life than what I thought he could provide." "And you filed for divorce seeking half of what you believed to be his assets." "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, you left a multimillionaire because you thought he was unsuccessful, and now you want him to give you money?" Pemberton jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, my client's reasons for seeking divorce are irrelevant to the question of asset division. Regardless of why the marriage ended, she's entitled to her share of marital property." "Mr. Pemberton, you're absolutely correct. She is entitled to her share of marital property. The question is whether any marital property actually exists." Judge Morrison opened the second folder and began examining the patent documentation. The courtroom remained silent while she read, the only sound the turning of pages and the quiet hum of the ventilation system. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she looked up. "Mr. Rothwell, I'm seeing patent applications that date back to 2009. Investment accounts opened in 2011. Trust documents from 2013. All of this predates Mr. Fox's marriage by years." "Yes, Your Honor. And I'm seeing documentation that shows these assets were never commingled with marital funds." "Correct, Your Honor. Mr. Fox maintained completely separate accounts for his premarital assets. The income from those assets was never used for marital expenses." "Then how did the couple support their lifestyle?" "Mr. Fox operated his automotive repair business as a legitimate enterprise. The income from that business, approximately $60,000 per year, was used for household expenses. Mrs. Chen's part-time income, approximately $25,000 per year, was also contributed to household expenses." Judge Morrison was taking careful notes. "So the couple lived on roughly $85,000 per year, while Mr. Fox had investment income of over $500,000 annually?" "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Fox chose to live modestly and reinvest his patent and investment income to build additional wealth." "Where is that additional wealth now?" Marcus flipped to his final chart, and Zander knew this was the moment when the true scope of his wealth would be revealed. The numbers on the chart were staggering. Patent portfolios worth millions, investment accounts in the 8 figures, trust funds that generated more income in a month than most people earned in a year. "Your Honor, Mr. Fox's current net worth is approximately $47 million. The courtroom erupted.
Cassandra gasped and grabbed onto her attorney's arm for support. Pemberton dropped his legal pad. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine with shock. Judge Morrison banged her gavel once. Order. Mr. Rothwell, you're telling me that Mr. Fox is worth $47 million? Yes, Your Honor, and every penny of it is documented as separate property that predates his marriage. Judge Morrison turned to look at Cassandra again, and there was something in her expression that might have been pity. Mrs. Chen, do you understand what you've just learned? Cassandra was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the reality of her situation became undeniable. I had no idea. He never told me. We lived like I thought we were struggling. Mrs. Chen, according to this documentation, your husband was supporting your lifestyle while accumulating additional wealth of several $1,000,000 per year. You left him because you thought he wasn't ambitious enough? I didn't know, Cassandra whispered. I thought he was satisfied with being ordinary. Judge Morrison closed the folders and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Pemberton, do you wish to challenge any of this documentation? Pemberton looked like a man who had just been run over by a truck. Your Honor, we would need time to have this information independently verified. Of course. I'm ordering a 30-day continuance to allow for complete financial investigation. I want independent accountants to verify every document, every date, every dollar. If Mr. Fox has been truthful about the timing and separation of these assets, then we'll proceed accordingly. If there's any evidence of deception or commingling, we'll address that as well. She banged her gavel. Court is adjourned until November 15th at 9 a.m. As the courtroom emptied, Zander remained seated, watching Cassandra as she struggled to process what she'd learned. She was still crying, but quietly now. The kind of tears that come when you realize you've made a mistake so fundamental that it can never be corrected. Pemberton was gathering his papers with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. His reputation was built on maximizing settlements for abandoned spouses. He'd never handled a case where the spouse had abandoned a fortune and was now asking for table scraps. Marcus packed his briefcase with the satisfaction of an attorney who had just executed a perfect legal strategy. They'd revealed nothing that wasn't true, hidden nothing that was required to be disclosed, and protected assets that were legitimately separate property. As they walked out of the courtroom, Zander could hear Cassandra talking to her attorney in the hallway. Her voice was shaking, but there was anger in it now. The kind of anger that comes when someone realizes they've been outsmarted. You said this would be straightforward. You said he was just a mechanic with a small business. You said I'd get half of everything. Pemberton's response was quiet, but Zander could hear the defeat in it. I investigated everything I could find. Your ex-husband was very careful about what was visible and what wasn't. He lied to me. For our entire marriage, he lied to me. No, Mrs. Chen, he didn't lie. He just didn't tell you things you never asked about. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and Zander walked toward the parking lot without speaking. The confrontation had gone exactly as they'd planned, but Zander found himself thinking about the look on Cassandra's face when she'd realized what she'd given up. Feel good about that? Marcus asked as they reached their cars. Zander considered the question carefully. I feel like justice was served. She left me for what she thought was a better opportunity. Now she knows what she actually walked away from. Thinks she'll try to challenge the documentation?
She can try, but every patent filing is registered with the USPTO. Every investment transaction is documented by regulated financial institutions. Every trust document was prepared by licensed attorneys and filed with the appropriate authorities. There's nothing to challenge. Marcus nodded. 30 days from now, Judge Morrison will confirm that your ex-wife is entitled to exactly half of the marital assets, which amounts to roughly $193,000. She'll also confirm that you'll retain your separate property worth $47 million. And then it's over. Then it's over. Zander climbed into his 15-year-old truck and started the engine. It ran perfectly because he'd rebuilt it himself using knowledge that had made him millions. He drove out of the courthouse parking lot, past Cassandra's BMW, past Pemberton's Mercedes, in a vehicle that looked like it belonged to someone who worked for a living. 30 days from now, he would return to this courthouse for the final hearing. Judge Morrison would review the independent investigation, confirm that all documentation was legitimate, and award Cassandra exactly what she was entitled to under the law. She would leave with enough money to live comfortably for years, but she would also leave with the knowledge that she had walked away from one of the largest personal fortunes in the state because she'd been too focused on appearances to see substance. Zander would leave with his wealth intact, his privacy protected, and his faith in patience and preparation confirmed once again. He would go back to his garage, put on his coveralls, and continue doing the work he loved while building the fortune that few people would ever know existed. The difference was that now, finally, he would be free to do it without wondering when the next person would try to take it away from him. 30 days passed like 30 years for everyone except Zander Fox. While teams of forensic accountants crawled through 15 years of his financial records, while Cassandra's attorney hired investigators to search for any crack in the documentation, while his ex-wife struggled to sleep knowing she'd walked away from a fortune, Zander went to work every morning at 7:30 and came home every evening at 6. The investigation was as thorough as Judge Morrison had promised it would be. 3 separate accounting firms verified every patent filing, traced every investment transaction, and confirmed the timeline of every asset acquisition. A forensic technology expert authenticated the dates on digital documents. A retired USPTO examiner reviewed the patent applications to confirm their legitimacy and timing. The results were unanimous and devastating to Cassandra's case. Every document was authentic. Every timeline was accurate. Every claim Marcus Rothwell had made in court was supported by evidence that would satisfy the most demanding audit. Zander Fox had indeed been a multimillionaire years before he'd met his future wife, and he had indeed maintained that wealth as completely separate property throughout their marriage. The morning of November 15th arrived cold and clear. Zander drove to the courthouse in the same truck, wearing the same type of clothes, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence that had characterized him throughout this entire ordeal. The only difference was that today it would finally be over. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Word had somehow leaked about the unusual case, and several local attorneys had come to observe what was being called the divorce case of the decade. A man who looked poor but was rich, married to a woman who left him for being unsuccessful, now asking for money from the fortune she'd never known existed. Judge Morrison entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and the courtroom rose. She looked like a woman who had spent the past month reviewing some of the most interesting documentation of her career. She'd seen wealthy people try to hide assets in divorce proceedings, but she'd never seen someone successfully hide wealth during a marriage while living authentically as a working-class person. "Please be seated," she said, settling behind the bench with a thick folder that contained the results of the independent investigation. "We're here for final disposition in the matter of Chen versus Fox. I've reviewed the reports from all investigating parties, and I'm prepared to render my decision." She opened the folder and put on her reading glasses. "The court finds that Mr. Zander Fox entered into marriage with substantial separate property, including but not limited to multiple patents, licensing agreements, investment portfolios, and trust funds. The court finds that these assets were properly maintained as separate property throughout the marriage, with no commingling of funds or assets." Cassandra was gripping her attorney's arm so tightly that Pemberton winced. She knew what was coming, but hearing it made official was somehow worse than the speculation of the past month. The court further finds that the marital estate, consisting of assets acquired during the marriage through joint effort and marital funds, has a total value of $386,000. Mrs. Chen is entitled to 50% of this amount, or $193,000. Judge Morrison removed her glasses and looked directly at Cassandra. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be very clear about what this court is and is not saying. This court is not saying that your ex-husband deceived you. The evidence shows that he lived authentically as a working person while maintaining substantial separate wealth. This court is not saying that you made the wrong choice in ending your marriage. That was your decision to make based on the information you had." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many people destroy their lives through poor decisions. What this court is saying is that you are entitled to exactly what the law provides: half of the assets acquired during your marriage. Nothing more, nothing less. Pemberton made one final attempt. Your Honor, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, we would ask the court to consider the equity of this division. Mrs. Chen supported her husband's lifestyle while having no knowledge of his true financial position. Judge Morrison's expression didn't change. Mr. Pemberton, equity is not a legal standard in asset division. The law is clear. Separate property remains separate. Marital property is divided equally. Your client received the benefit of her husband's income during the marriage. She is not entitled to the benefit of assets she never knew existed and never contributed to acquiring. She banged her gavel once. The court awards Mrs. Chen the sum of $193,000, representing her 50% share of marital assets. Mr. Fox retains all separate property. This matter is concluded. As the courtroom emptied, Zander remained seated until Cassandra and her attorney had left. He could hear her in the hallway, her voice shaking with emotion that sounded like grief mixed with rage. "This can't be legal. There has to be something we can do. He had $47 million and I get less than $200,000? Pemberton's response was wary. "Mrs. Chen, he had $47 million when you married him. You just didn't know it. The law doesn't require people to disclose separate property to their spouses." "But I lived with him for 5 years. I shared his life. I deserve to know." "Maybe you did deserve to know, but not knowing doesn't create a legal claim to assets you never had a right to." Marcus and Zander walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters who had somehow learned about the case and were waiting for comments neither man would provide. They reached the parking lot where Cassandra stood beside her BMW, crying into her phone. "Derek, I can't explain it over the phone. Just,
He's worth almost $50 million, and I get nothing. Less than nothing." There was a pause, and then her voice rose. "No, I didn't know. If I'd known, do you think I would have left him?" Zander stopped walking. For a moment, he considered approaching her, maybe offering some words of comfort or explanation. But what would be the point? She'd made her choice based on what she valued, and now she was living with the consequences. No conversation would change that. Instead, he climbed into his truck and drove away from the courthouse for the last time. As he passed Cassandra, still crying into her phone beside her BMW, he felt something he hadn't expected: relief. Not because he'd won, but because it was finally over. 3 months later, Zander received a letter forwarded through Marcus Rothwell's office. The return address showed Derek Chen's name, and the contents were brief but telling. "Mr. Fox, I'm writing to ask if you would consider hiring me as a sales representative for your patent licensing business. My wife has explained the situation, and I realize I may have misjudged your professional accomplishments. I have extensive experience in pharmaceutical sales and believe I could help you expand your licensing agreements. Please consider my attached resume." Zander read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Derek Chen's pharmaceutical sales experience wasn't relevant to automotive patents, and his wife's new understanding of her ex-husband's wealth had obviously created stress in their marriage. The man was grasping for solutions to problems that had nothing to do with Zander Fox. 6 months after the final court hearing, Zander sold his automotive repair business to his longtime mechanic, Tony Rodriguez, for exactly what it was worth as a going concern. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do years earlier: build substantial wealth while living authentically as a working person. Now that his privacy was protected and his assets secure, he could move on to the next phase of his life. He bought a larger workshop on 10 acres outside the city where he could work on patent development without curious neighbors or ex-wives who might wonder why a mechanic spent so much time with computers and technical drawings. He hired a small team of engineers who understood that their work was confidential and that their employer preferred anonymity to recognition. The new patents that emerged from this workshop were even more revolutionary than his earlier work: improvements to electric vehicle systems that major manufacturers licensed before their competitors understood what they were buying, battery management innovations that doubled the range of electric trucks, software algorithms that made autonomous vehicles safer and more efficient. Each patent was filed under different corporate entities. Each entity was owned by trusts that existed in states with strong privacy protections,
and each trust was managed by attorneys who specialized in keeping brilliant people invisible, but nobody knew. The fortune that had protected Zander through his divorce continued to grow exponentially, but nobody knew except the people who needed to know. A year after the divorce was finalized, Zander received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed Cassandra's number, but when he answered, the voice was unfamiliar. "Mr. Fox, this is Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. I'm Cassandra Chen's therapist. She's asked me to call you." Zander almost hung up, but something in the woman's tone made him listen. What does she want? She wants to apologize, not for leaving you, but for the way she left. She's realized that she spent 5 years married to you without ever really trying to know you, and she wants to tell you she's sorry for that. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate the gesture, but an apology isn't necessary. We both made choices, and we're both living with the consequences." She's also pregnant. The stress of the divorce and the financial pressure it created in her new marriage has been difficult. She's not asking for anything from you. She just wanted you to know that she understands now what she lost, and it wasn't the money. Zander considered this information carefully. What did she lose? A man who built something extraordinary while staying true to who he was. She said you were the most authentic person she'd ever known, and she was too focused on appearances to recognize authenticity when she was living with it. After he hung up, Zander sat in his new workshop surrounded by prototypes and patents that would reshape entire industries. Through the windows, he could see the rolling hills that surrounded his property, land he'd bought because it reminded him of the view from his father's garage. He thought about Cassandra, pregnant and struggling in a marriage built on debt and appearances. He thought about Derek Chen, desperate enough to beg for a job from the man whose wife he'd stolen. He thought about the attorneys and accountants and investigators who had spent months trying to find flaws in documentation that was perfectly legal and completely authentic. Most of all, he thought about his father, who had taught him that real wealth wasn't about what people thought you owned, but about what you actually owned and how you chose to use it. Samuel Fox had built a fortune while looking like a working man, and he'd passed that fortune to a son who had built it into something extraordinary while looking exactly the same. The phone rang again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was Victoria Sterling, his wealth management attorney, calling with news about his latest investment. A startup company in California had developed breakthrough technology for wireless electric vehicle charging, and they needed funding to bring it to market. "The technology is solid, the team is brilliant, the market potential is enormous, but they need a lead investor who understands the automotive industry and won't demand public recognition." Zander smiled. It was exactly the kind of opportunity his father had taught him to recognize. Brilliant people doing revolutionary work, needing only capital and patience to change the world. How much do they need? $12 million for full development and market rollout. Another industry you want to revolutionize from the shadows? Dr. Sterling, the shadows are where the real work gets done. After he hung up, Zander walked outside into the evening air. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that no amount of money could buy. Somewhere in the city, his ex-wife was probably struggling with morning sickness and marriage problems caused by her discovery of what she'd given up. Somewhere else, Derek Chen was probably lying awake calculating debt payments and wondering how he'd ended up married to a woman who measured love in dollars. But here, on 10 acres of land bought with money earned from solving problems and building solutions, Zander Fox was exactly where he belonged. Invisible to people who measure success by appearances, but working on innovations that would improve millions of lives while generating wealth that most people couldn't imagine. His father had been right about everything. Power didn't need to announce itself. Success didn't require recognition. And the most secure fortunes were the ones nobody knew existed until it was too late to take them away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.